Good morning, everyone. My name is Moshe Kurtz. I think the vast majority of you on here know that because it looks like you're all from the shul. So hopefully you know me at this point after over a year and a half of being here. First of all, I want to welcome Peter Abelow. Is that how we pronounce it?
That's fine, correct.
Who will be our tour guide this morning and will give us a taste of what it feels like to be in Eretz Yisrael, even though we are all the way here in the United States. I want to give a huge thank you to Susan for organizing this. Susan has looked into every single detail to make sure it's a success, to make sure it's a smooth experience, and God willing, that's what it'll be for all of us. I think this is the first. Are there other in the series, or this is a one-off, Susan?
No, this is the first.
So first in
Three.
First in three. Okay. So this is exciting. We have a trilogy set up for us. Now, I just want to introduce Peter, just get a little bit of his bio so we could appreciate his expertise and who we have with us today. And then, of course, I'll let him take his presentation from here. Peter is the co-founder of Israel is Beautiful, Israel Educator and Tour Guide. Peter is a licensed tour guide. For 18 years until his retirement in 2017, he was one of the directors of Keshet, the Center for Educational Tourism in Israel. He continues to inspire and engage families and groups as they tour the length and breadth of the country, as well as through virtual, you are there, online tours. Peter grew up in New York City and attended the High School of Music and Art. He has degrees in engineering and law from Brooklyn Law School, as well as an extensive Jewish education. His love of the outdoors, however, probably began as a member of the Boy Scouts, where he attained the rank of Eagle Scout. Before immigrating to Israel with his wife and 4 children in 1990, Dr. Abelow was a principal in Jewish high schools, first in New York and then in Baltimore. From what I understand, you worked with Rabbi Riskin in that capacity. So I think we have many Rabbi Riskin fans here at the shul. And for 13 years, he also taught basic Judaism to beginners and converts in a highly acclaimed adult education program up the Lincoln Square Synagogue in New York City, which now makes sense where you had that connection. It is a privilege to have you with us, and we're very excited for you to give us a taste of Eretz Yisrael today.
That's for me. Thank you, Rabbi Kurtz. Wow, that's pretty impressive. That's me.
You gotta thank Susan. She sent it over.
Wow. So, Susan, thank you. First of all, it's just a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I also want to welcome Ani Schiffmiller, who is my partner in this virtual endeavor, which was motivated by the dramatic shift that brought about in the tourist business in Israel by the onset of COVID 2 years ago. And also acknowledge Susan, whom we were figuring out, we know each other at least 47 years, and probably more than that. So more than that, huh?
And people should know that Ani is from Easton.
What?
Then Ani is from Connecticut. She's from Easton, Connecticut.
Oh.
Okay, so here we go. We're going to be doing a tiyul today. So is everybody properly prepared? I mean, you need good walking shoes. Right? Good walking shoes. Okay. Water bottle and water bottle carrier. So all of those are critical as we get around the land of Israel. And I'm going to go to my screen share. And here we go. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
You should be seeing a very familiar page. That's your homepage on the Agudat Shalom website. All right,
Yes.
Let me just make sure. Now I got to make sure, though. Here we go. I want to get share sound. Okay, fine. So welcome aboard, everybody. I guess, we were saying before we came on how blessed we are. Maybe just when everybody was coming on that I don't need my hat. It was just for the, set the mood. Obviously the entire world, Israel included, of course, Connecticut, the United States included, have been reeling from the effects of the COVID onslaught, the things that we know, the things we still don't know. And one of the devastating effects in Israel was the inability of really the total collapse of the tourist industry, which means from your point of view, the inability to get here and to enjoy Israel and to take advantage of everything that the 21st century offers in appreciating the land of Israel. So Susan put together a series of 3. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And I am pleased to be your host on a series of 3 Sundays, one in January, one in February, ta-da, and one in March, as we experience 3 different sides of Israel. Today, we're going to be walking along what's known as the Derech HaAvot, or the pathway of the patriarchs, which is a road which we believe that the patriarchs and matriarchs walked on some 3,800 years ago. We're going to move up in time in February, about 5 weeks from today, at a place called Kfar Yehoshua, which is a wonderful part of the story of the development of the Galilee in the early part of the 20th century, and more about that when we get there. And then on our final visit on the Sunday, March 13th, 4 weeks after the February one, we're going to take us into Jerusalem and one of the lovely neighborhoods, which I'm sure many of you who've been to Israel recognize very well, the Emek Rephaim neighborhood. But today, let's focus on, and this is our website. We created a website, and one of the bonuses that we have arranged through the good offices of Susan and your shul is that at the end of the 3 weeks, you will all be given a complimentary, or the means of getting a complimentary membership to the website, which today we began thinking about it just when COVID hit. So that's almost 2 years ago. Our first virtual Tiyul went up on Erev Rosh Hashanah a year and a half ago. And we put the one up every Thursday, and we now have 71 Tiyulim in our members area, our virtual tours area. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, and they will all be available to you as members of this group at the end of the series. But here we are. Let's head off today on what's known as Derech HaAvot, which I have loosely translated, despite the sign, as the route of the patriarchs, or the pathway of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, because they were along this road together. And we're going to try over the next hour to experience this magnificent road in the heart of Judea, a road upon which our ancestors walked. But before we do that, I actually want to start with a pasuk. And let's see, I've learned a lot about the technology of Zoom and all sorts of stuff. So let's see if this works. First of all, a verse from the book of Breshit, when Avraham is told, Kum hitalech ba'aretz, get up and walk through the land of Israel. And so in order to begin our walk along the path that Abraham presumably walked on, I found this song, which was a very popular song in Israel a number of years ago, which is an amazing introduction. The transliteration and the transliteration are all mine. The ... is because I kind of ran out of room, but this is the essential part of the beginning of the song, our introduction to our fulfilling the mitzvah, which was given to Avraham so many years ago, of kum hitalech ba'aretz, come up, get up, and walk the land of Israel. Let's hear. Are you hearing this?
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
יחפשו אותך דרכיה של הארץ הטובה, היא תקרא אותך אליה כמו אל ארץ אהבה. זאת אכן אותה הארץ, זאת אותה האדמה, ואותה פיסת הסלע הנצרבת בחמה, ומתחת לאספלט לבנייני הרעבה מסתתרת המולדת ביישנית וענווה.
And the chorus again.
היא תקרא אותך אליה כמו אל ארץ אהבה.
All right, so it's a very
That recording
beautiful,
was made years later, right?
years after Abraham, I presume so. Yes.
No. I mean, the voices, the singing was made after this video. He's not singing, right?
Oh, sure he is. No, this is a live recording.
Oh,
It's not.
sounds like,
I mean, I found a number of versions of the song on the internet. This is the one I liked. And I thought it was a lovely way to begin. First of all, as a reminder that there's so much about modern Israel, which pulsates with Jewish tradition and Jewish history, and our Jewish background and connection to the land. Now, this is a song that became an extremely popular song in Israel. Kum hitalech baretz, get up and hike the land of Israel. Israelis love to hike. And yet the imagery that comes to mind is a pasuk from the Torah, from Breshit. Kum hitalech ba'aretz. You heard another echo in Eretz HaTovah, right? And from Devarim, we talk the mitzvah of Birchat Hamazon is to bless the Eretz HaTovah. And that kind of pulsates around Israel, that the things even in secular or non-frum or moderately traditional Israel are still nevertheless steeped in our tradition and our history. So we are going to get up, and in the tradition of our patriarchs who were commanded to get up and hitalech la'aretz, to walk the length and the breadth of the land of Israel, so will we. And today, and again, I love that next verse, Zot achen otah haaretz. This is the same land. I think it's an allusion to the pasuk. These are the land that our patriarchs and matriarchs walked on. Zo otah hadama. It's the same earth. And underneath the asphalt and underneath the buildings, the homeland is hiding. The moledet, the ancient, only has to be uncovered. And that's what we're about to do today as we walk along the pathway of the patriarchs and matriarchs, attempt to uncover some of the ancient. Let's go on. Okay, so the time frame for today's little mini tiyul is the period of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, which takes us back, for those not familiar totally with the chronology, about 3,800 years ago, about 1800 BCE. We're going to also relate briefly to the period of King David, some 800 years later, of course, after the Jewish people have now entered the land of Israel and established the monarchy. David, the second king of Israel, 1000 BCE. We'll relate briefly to Bayit Rishon, which of course was not built by David HaMelech, but built by his son Shlomo HaMelech in 960 and stood until destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. We will relate something very amazing to something Bayit Sheni, which of course arose on the ashes of Bayit Rishon 70 years later, after the beginning of the return of the Jewish people after the Babylonian exile. And then a brief reference, if we have time, to Mered Bar Kokhba after the Churban Bayit Sheni, after the destruction of the Second Temple, 132 to 135 CE. So we're only going to cover about 2,000 years of history today in the next hour or so. All right, what is Derech HaAvot? So Derech HaAvot is actually the name given to the pathway that our patriarchs and matriarchs walked on when they entered the land of Israel, as described so beautifully in the, I would say the first 16, 18 prakim chapters of the book of Breshit of Genesis. You know that when Avraham and his entourage come into the land of Israel, they first come to Shechem. And so our Derech HaAvot begins in Shechem. Today is Nablus. You know, of course, when Yaakov returns from his 22 years with Lavan, with Rachel and Leah, with Rachel and Leah, they also come to Shechem. And so this figures not only in the narrative of Avraham, but in the narrative of his grandchildren. The next thing along the pathway, Beit El, where Avraham builds an altar to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And again, Jacob, on his fleeing from Esav, passes in Beit El. That's where, according to Chazal, he has his dream. And so we have Beit El along this route. And again, I want you to kind of look at this route, place it on a map of Israel. Beit Lechem figures very prominently in the story, particularly as the burial of Rachel Imenu. Moving further down, Hebron, Kiryat Arba, which we encounter in terms of the death of Sarah for the first time and the purchase of the Maramat Machpelah, and the place where Avram and family also settled, not only in Hebron, Kiryat Arba, but in Beit Lechem. And so this is called Derech HaAvot. There were two other routes in ancient times, by the way. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but there was Derech Hayam, which went along the coast, Derech HaMelech, which went along the Jordan Valley from the south, and the Derech HaAvot, which is Derech HaHar, which is the pathway along the mountain ridges, basically from Beersheba to Nablus, or in ancient terminology, Shechem. So what are we going to be doing today? We're going to be exploring an area or a section of this Derech HaAvot between Beit Lechem and Hebron. In the red circle here, it's in the area of Gush Etzion, where I and our family live. I should say a word, by the way. Thank you for your introduction, Rabbi Kurtz. Yes, I grew up in New York, in Manhattan. I am a graduate of the High School of Music and Art, which were probably some of the best years of my life. I attended also the Herzliya School on the West Side while I was in public high school. Also a graduate of CCNY, where I was the president of the Hillel of CCNY and was actually president the year of the Six-Day War in 1967, which was an amazing time to be in the active circles of Jewish life. I went to law school, but was also very much involved in Rabbi Riskin's congregation on the west side of Manhattan. And when he opened his new school in Riverdale in 1974, I was, somebody's mic is on.
Now.
Somebody's mic is on.
I'm taking a walk.
Somebody's mic is on. Please mute everybody. I think I can mute you, right? Can I mute everybody?
Yeah, I'm working on muting people. You don't have to worry about that.
Okay, all right, thank you. Rabbi Riskin implored me to join him in helping him found his school. So I put my law career on hold for a year back in 1974 after having finished law school and passed the bar. And that was the end of my law career because I ended up with Rabbi Riskin for 10 years, eventually not only teaching math, but becoming the general studies principal, was the principal of the Beth Tefillah High School in Baltimore. And then I think my first trip to Israel as a teenager planted the seeds to what we did in 1990, and that is move to Israel. And we've been here, Baruch Hashem, for 31 years, coming up this summer on our 32nd year in Israel. We came with teenagers, all of whom are now raising their own families, thank God, in Israel. We have 15 grandchildren, all of whom live in Efrat, where we live, by the way, and a daughter yet to be married, God willing, B'karov b'yameinu, but that's a little bit about me. And we live in the Gush Etzion city of Efrat, which is the city founded by Rabbi Riskin back in the early 1980s. When we got here, we were like the 490th, 491st, and 492nd people in Efrat. The city has grown now to a city of 12,000. And in my backyard, literally, is Derech HaAvot, the pathway of the patriarchs. And so we are going to now walk along. That should have been a slide. Where did it go? The pathway of the patriarchs. Okay, so in order to do that, I have to stop screen share for one moment and go to another set of materials. So here it is. Let me just find it. Right. Okay, here we are. All righty. And this is actually the footage that I took for one of the videos on our website along Derech HaAvot. And I'm going to be using it today with you to literally walk together as partners along the Derech HaAvot, which is literally maybe 3 miles from my house. In one of our earlier homes, we actually lived on the crest, and we could look out from the shul window over where the patriarchs and matriarchs and the kings walked thousands of years ago. So join me now as we walk along Derech HaAvot. And now this is going to be, if it's working properly, a literally moving experience, not simply the PowerPoint stills, but we're going to walk together. These slides should come up and we'll begin our walk along the Derech HaAvot. For those of you who know the Gush, it's behind Alon Shvut. And why isn't it coming up? Because it worked an hour ago, right? So it should be working now too. It is loading. You know what? I'm just going to stop sharing for a minute. You know what? I'm going to reload this up.
Don't worry, I have the same issue when I give my classes as well.
Right? All right, so let's go. Let's try this. Okay, there we go. All right, so now we're going to start walking together.
Let's run.
Okay, so this is the beginning of the section which is known as the Derech HaAvot. And I think one of the questions that we want to deal with is how it is that we know with such certainty. I've kind of muted the actual narration, which appears on the virtual video on the website, and I'll be narrating this. But how do we know with such certainty that this section of road, which we're going to be walking on today, is actually appropriate labeled Derech HaAvot? So I'm going to hold that question in abeyance for a second. Let's begin our walk. I don't want this one. We'll walk on this piece over here. Again, those of you familiar with the area, that's one of the kibbutzim of the area, kibbutz Rosh Surim, and some of the vegetation along this road. And now walk with me. And again, before I address the question of how do we know, I want to take a brief moment to look at some of the vegetation, and in particular, this tree, which is one of the first trees that we encounter along this portion of Derech HaAvot. Does anybody happen to recognize it? It's a fig tree, and it's worth stopping at the fig tree for a moment because, as many of you know, the fig tree was actually one of the first vegetations mentioned in the Bible, in the book of Breshit, in the creation story. In what context? Well, in Gan Eden. You know that Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, are placed in the garden, and they're given this amazing natural supermarket by God, who says, anything you want is yours. All of the vegetation is yours. Oh, by the way, except for that one tree, which does not have a hashgacha. Right? Do not eat from the, well, what is it? Eitz Hadas. It's Eitz Hadas. We don't quite know exactly what it is. Chazal speculate what it is. I mean, we often portray it as an apple tree, but whatever it is, they're told not to eat from that tree. You can eat anything else. And of course, you know the story. The snake talks Chava, Eve, into eating from it. Eve says, wow, this is pretty delicious, gives it to her husband. They are caught by God. And what happens next? What happens next is rather interesting. First of all, here's the pasuk from Breshit, right? When the woman saw, Vatira Isha ki tov ha'etz lema'achal, the woman saw, wow, this is a good tree for food. V'kitavahu le'nayit, then it was pleasing to the eye. Oh, and she also desirable for gaining wisdom. So she took some and ate it, and then she gave some to her husband, and he ate it. And the eyes of both of them were opened. V'tikach mipiriyo v'tocha v'titem gam l'isha ima. Okay, ki arimim. And what do they now recognize with their newfound knowledge? They recognize that they are naked, and they're embarrassed by their newfound knowledge. And so the pasuk goes on to say, "Vayitparu alei teina," and so they sewed together fig leaves. Aha, we're at a fig tree, and they made clothing for themselves. Vayasu lahem chagurot. Now I'm going to come back to this picture in just a moment. We don't have any pictures of Adam and Eve, but this kind of does it, right? So here we are, Chava and Adam in their new fig leaf clothing, shielding them from the embarrassment of now knowing they're naked. But there's another pasuk just a few pasukim later on. And what does it say? Vayas Hashem Elokim la'adam le'ishto tonot or. Oh, wait a minute. But God gave them garments of skin for Adam and his wife. And that's when he made clothing, v'yilbashon. And that's how he clothed them. And it's, I think it's just kind of an acute aside as we stand by the fig tree to realize what happened to their fig leaves. Because yes, they were knowledgeable, but they didn't realize that in a short time, this is what their leaves would look like. They would shrivel up and die. And therefore, if they really wanted to be clothed, the Kadosh Baruch Hu made for them ketonet or garments of leather. Moving a little bit further along, now we're going to perhaps come to an answer to our question. So this entire walk, I've done this, by the way, by foot. I mean, this is my car in the picture here when we filmed this. but I've done this with a number of groups by foot. It's about a mile and a half walk. It's very pleasant, very nice. And one of the first things that we encounter, indeed that archaeologists encounter in developing this road, is this pillar, which I will stop just before we end the video, right over here. Okay. And you might even be able to kind of peek at the sign on the right over there. This pillar is a Roman milestone. Aha. Now, if you go back to my slides from earlier on when I covered the time periods, the Roman period kind of dovetails the end of the Second Temple period. Just to give you again a quick review of Jewish history, the Jews come back from Bavel, rebuild Bayit Sheni. That's in about 516 BCE. About 300 years later, we have the turnover of power, actually 200 years later, with the invasion by Alexander the Great and the Babylonian, now Persian Empire being overtaken by the Greek Empire. And within 120 years or so, we have unfolding the story of Hanukkah. So let's put Hanukkah down at about 160 BCE. And Hanukkah, another 130 years, we have the establishment of a Maccabean dynasty, the Hashmonaim, and in the year 66 BCE, another turnover of power, the Roman period. So the Romans are here for perhaps the last 100 years of Bayit Sheni, of the Second Temple. And so when we find a Roman milestone along a road, that kind of fits and kind of helps us pinpoint this as a road that probably existed during Second Temple times. Now, archaeologists are pretty certain that over the course of history, certainly till modern times, when we began to dig tunnels and blast hills away, that roads followed the same pathways, kind of adhering to the topology of the land. So that if this was a major route in Roman times, which is the 1st century BCE, it was probably the same route that was traversed hundreds of years earlier in the period of kings, meaning David, some 700-800 years earlier, and probably even the patriarchs and the matriarchs 800 years before that. So that the discovery of things that pinpoint this as a major route in Roman times is pretty compelling evidence, albeit circumstantial, to archaeologists. So this is a Roman milestone on the road to Jerusalem. This is milestone number 13, actually. We are 13 Roman miles from Yerushalayim, heading in the direction that we are walking. I just gonna have to relate a little bit, I think, for a moment to something personal. When we moved from New York to Baltimore, when I became principal of the Beth Tefillah School in Baltimore, much of our family was still in New York. We were coming up on a bar mitzvah. We were actually coming up on a birth that year as well. Our youngest daughter, Shira, was born, and we decided to have the family remain in New York until after the bar mitzvah and the birth. And I already was in Baltimore commuting. Frequently, I took the train. Occasionally we drove, and even after we moved as a family, we would come back to New York frequently for smachot in the family, for Shabbos sometimes. What saved me on 95 in the Jersey Turnpike were the milestones, or the mileage markers. Now, I don't know how many of you ever noticed it when you drive up 95, but there are little squares on the side of the road with numbers. Those are mileage markers. Well, the concept of mileage markers goes way back in time, and the Romans had mileage markers in the forms of these pillars. We'll see 2 more in the course of our walk along the Derech HaAvot. But as we go along, the Derech HaAvot now brings us to something else which archaeologists consider one of the major finds of modern times. We're going to make our way up to those 3 arched coverings and climb a little bit of a foot of steps. Let me speed us up and get up over here. You notice the sign says we're along Derech HaAvot. And here along Derech HaAvot was one of the most amazing discoveries, which gave tremendous insight into the period of, in this case, Bayit Sheni. So walk with me. And here we are. Anybody want to take a guess? You might be able to read the sign as we pass by, but if not, oh my gosh, what is this? So hewn into the rock alongside this road is a mikveh. Wow, this is a late Bayit Sheni mikveh, which probably was used by pilgrims, Holchei Regel, on their way to Yerushalayim, possibly for the Shalosh Regalim, possibly just to visit Yerushalayim, to celebrate a birth, to celebrate something special, to bring a korban. And again, something that you in the greater New York area can relate to. And I'll go back to my trips from Baltimore to New York. I remember always being conscious of where the last gas stations were before you got into Manhattan, because the gas in Jersey was cheaper, right? I'm not sure if Connecticut is that much of a difference when you come down from Connecticut into New York, but coming from Jersey at least 30 years ago, there was a significant price difference. So we always would get gas. There were always signs, last cheap gas, get your gas in Jersey before you get the New York prices. So I kind of imagine, and this is no basis except for my own fanciful imagination, that there must have been a sign on the road, why stand on line for the long lines in the Jerusalem mikvahs? Why pay Jerusalem prices? Dunk here, you're only 9 Roman miles or 10 Roman miles from Jerusalem. Do your tefillah and continue on your journey. But there's something rather unusual about this mikvah, and I have a hunch that you're already beginning to think about it. 2 entrances, 2 doors. And this, in the next bit, I'm going to walk into the mikveh with you. This suddenly brought to light a Mishnah, which until this discovery was understood by Chazal, but never seen. So let's go in. We'll go into the mikveh. This was actually taken in September, a year and a half ago, this footage. So the water, which is basically rainwater, had all dissipated. It was pretty much dry, but you can go inside, turn around, come up the other side, meaning that it appears that this mikveh, as by the way, many mikvaot discovered in Jerusalem itself, particularly in the area of Har HaBayit, of the Temple Mount, had a separate entrance, or let's say 2 openings, presumably a separate entrance and a separate exit, and a wall in between them. Come along, Chazal, and here is the explanation. Here it is. All right, a Mishnah in Meshechet Shkalim. Mishnah says as follows: Kol hakelim hanimtzaim b'Yerushalayim derech yerida levet hatfilah tmein. Aha! All of the utensils which are found in the Azor of Yerushalayim, in the area of Jerusalem, derech yerida, on the way down to levet hatfilah, to the mikveh, the base of immersion, tmeim, or tamei, are impure. Derech aliyah, tohorim. On the way out, on the way up, aliyah literally means coming up, tahor, tahorim, pure. Implying what? That there must have been a discernible difference between going down and coming up. And indeed, the discovery of this mikveh, literally a few miles from my house along the Derech HaAvot, and the discovery of similar mikvahs, as I mentioned earlier on, gave clarity to that Mishnah. It is now simple to say, I'm assuming that the direction was American, not British, but we don't know, right? Meaning that you go down on the right and up on the left. But you would, if you happen to be going into the mikveh and you also wanted to take some sort of vessel with you to immerse it and purify it in the waters of the mikveh, if you were going down and you put it down for a minute and went in and you're so excited, you do your own tefillah, your own immersion, and you come up the other side, maybe you put your clothing on the stone ledge in the middle, you get redressed and you continue your journey, you're half hour down the road, oh no, I forgot my thing, right? If it was forgotten on the right side on the way in and then somebody came along afterwards and found it, what's the presumption, the Jewish law that the Mishnah gives? Tamei. Because it's on the way into the mikveh, meaning it hasn't been immersed yet, it hasn't been dunked yet. If it's found on the left side, meaning the side from which people emerged, so the presumption is just the opposite, tahor, and then you could assume there's a halachic presumption that the vessel has been indeed properly immersed and dunked into the waters of the mikveh, and the vessel is tahor. And the discovery of mikvehs like this all of a sudden give light to what our Rishonim and Poskim all speculated about before actually really seeing what a Second Temple period mikveh actually looked like. And we have one right here. Pretty fascinating, though. It's pretty amazing. All right, let's go off along the road a little further on. And what do we have here? Okay, yeah, 2 other trees I want to show you. Let's see where I put them. Okay, right. All right. We'll start with this one. This one is, I think, interesting to people in the Northeast. Take a look and see if you recognize the fruit of this tree. And what kind of tree is it? Anybody? You have them in Connecticut. I know you have them in Connecticut because
Nutmeg? Nutmeg?
A what?
Nutmeg?
No, not at
No.
all. No, let's see if I
They
can
look
get any
like
closer.
lychee. They
They
look like
do.
lychee.
But they actually look like something else.
I
Let's
don't
get them
know.
back again. Anybody? Now I know they exist in the Northeast because my parents had a summer house in Lake Mahopac, which is the other side of Connecticut. You're on the eastern side. The Connecticut, the Mahopac was just off the western side, but we had oak trees in our front yard, and these are acorns.
Oh,
I should get a better picture of an acorn, I guess, but these are acorns, and this is a
Yeah.
Mediterranean version of the oak tree.
uh,
The one thing, by the way, which is rather interesting, you notice that the leaves are significantly smaller than the oak trees that we're familiar with in the Northeast. If you have an oak tree near you, just take a look at the leaf, whether it's a white oak or a black oak. There are a lot of varieties of oaks in Connecticut. The leaves are much, much larger. And the reason is that the oak tree in the Middle East adapts to the arid conditions. Rain is a very scarce, rain is a very scarce commodity. And so the leaves were developed in such, or were evolved in such a way that the amount of evaporation through the leaves was minimal. You still need the chlorosynthesis to be taking place, but the leaves are much, much smaller than their North American cousins. In any event, so that's one tree along the Derech Havot, but the other tree is really topical, and let's take a look at it. That's over here, I think. Did I get it right? There we go. Let's see if you can identify this one. Oh, this is the wrong picture. Wait a second. Hold on. Wait. Sorry. Another milestone. Where? Oh, here it is. Here it is. I'm sorry. Okay. Let's see if we can identify this one. Now I'm going to come in close so you can get a look at the fruit. And remember, this tree, the picture of this tree was taken in the month of September. All right, anybody? Those are almonds.
oh, goodness.
And this is an ashkediyah. And this is the way an almond tree looks like. Actually, look at the date on September 18th. When did I take this? September 18th, 2020 is when I filmed this. So this is what an almond tree looks like at the end of the summer. Many of the leaves have already fallen off. Most of the almonds that are ripe have been picked or fallen off. There's still some almonds left on the branches, but that is what an almond tree looks like. And along the Derech Havot, and indeed all over the land of Israel, there are many, many almond trees. How do you say almond in Hebrew? Now, I grew up on this in New York, and I bet many of you did also. Shkediyah parachat, the almond tree is blossoming in the middle of January. That's what we were singing. I went to Hebrew school. So in Hebrew school, we say, the almond tree is blossoming. Who are you kidding? It's freezing outside. Did it snow in Stamford recently? Like in the last couple of days?
Yes.
What are you singing song? You know when Tu B'Shvat is? What today is 7, 8, 9, today is Tet Shvat. Tu B'Shvat's in a week. Right? Mm-hmm. Can you imagine trees blossoming in Stamford, Connecticut a week from today? And yet everybody sing, we make a Tu B'Shvat Seder and we start singing Ashkediyah Parachat. And the reason is because this is what this tree will look like next week here in Israel. And it's kind of hard to believe that in the middle of what is still the winter, for most of us, certainly with a North American mentality, all of a sudden the Shkediyah begins to bloom. And you begin to get a sense that even though you're in mid-January, and this year we have an extra Adar, so the year's a little bit longer, but somehow, wow, spring isn't really that far away. Now, I want to tell you something interesting about the Shkedia. And this, by the way, this was taken last year in springtime, in January. This is what Israel will look like in a week and 10 days all over the country, with blooming almond trees and beautiful pink and white blossoms all over. So here too, the Tanakh gives us a wonderful, wonderful insight. Let me go back to my psukim, and here we are. There's Abraham. Okay, here we are. Sefer Yirmiyahu. Now let's put this into a frame of reference. Who is Yirmiyahu? Yirmiyahu was a very late Navi, one of the later Naviim of the Bayit Rishon period. As a matter of fact, Yirmiyahu, along with Yechezkel, actually lived at the time of the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. Yirmiyahu in his prophecies was not terribly popular because he was warning against wrong political alliances that the king shouldn't make. We shouldn't be allying with Egypt. We should be allying ourselves with Bavel, with Babylonia. That's by far the more powerful force to reckon with. Mitzafon tipateh hara'ah, says Yirmiyahu. From the north will burst south the evil, not from the south. Don't align with Egypt. You're putting yourself into the hands of you're aligning with Babylon's enemy. And when Babylonia goes after Egypt, we're going to be seen as the bad guys too? Nope. All right. Nevertheless, the people didn't listen. You know what happens. Babylon attacks Nebuchadnezzar. And this is in Perek Aleph of Yirmiyahu. Vayehi davar Hashem elai lemor. And God's word appeared to me saying, Ma'ata ro'eh Yirmiyahu. Va'omar. And I said, remember this is Jeremiah talking, Makel shaked ani roeh. Oh, shaked? Shkedia? I see a staff of an almond tree. In this metaphor that God is setting up for Jeremiah, he pictures a stick from an almond tree. Okay? Vayomer Hashem elai, next pasuk, and God said to me, Hey, tafta lirot, you're seeing well. Ki shoked ani al divarai la'asoto. There is the same word, shoked. Shkedia, almond tree, but now it's a verb. What is shoked ani? I'm going to make it happen quickly. It's going to happen before its time. It's going to happen very soon, just as the almond tree kind of happens very quickly before its time, very soon. Indeed, that etymologically, the word almond tree comes from the same shin kuf dalid, shoked, as this verse used in the prophecy, or the vision to Jeremiah. So here we are. And once again, the Bible literally comes alive if you open your eyes and you look at the things that we see around us through biblical glasses. And the appearance of blossoming, where are we? Of blossoming almond trees all over the land of Israel, for many with a biblical frame of reference, underscore our dependence upon God and our need to rely upon God, and to trust the people that are properly leading us in God's way. And I'm going to leave that because that's such a phrase filled with all sorts of potential. But there we are, the almond tree, all along Derech HaAvot. Let's go further along. And no, it's not where I wanted. I want to go back in my slides to this. Okay. And climb up to the observation tower that has been built for us along the road, and look out over a spectacular view and see two other things. I must tell you, by the way, I hope you are getting a sense, walking along with me, that we're literally walking in the footsteps of those who preceded us thousands of years ago. There's the view from the top. That wasn't it. I juggled the order to make it work, and they're all out of order all of a sudden. So here we are. Okay, this is the view from the top. We go up those steps to like a little platform and look out. And I want to relate to one other thing, actually two other things from the top over here. First of all, as I was saying, that we are, I think one of the amazing things about living in Israel, and I think just a personal glimpse. So, I was in Jewish education. When I made Aliyah, 1990, I'm in my mid 40s. It was something I desperately wanted to do. I just believed we belonged here. I think one of the motivating factors, our son Avi was graduating high school, our oldest son, had gone on the March of the Living that year. We've been to Israel as a family many times. I had led school trips. I led 2 adult trips for Lincoln Square Synagogue. So us and our kids had certainly tasted Israel, but Avi went off on the March of the Living, and I'm sure many of you know that the March of the Living is the Poland-Israel journey for teens through Auschwitz and the camps of Poland, a week in Poland, and then a week in Israel, making the obvious connections. And Avi came back from that trip in the spring of '90, and he said, I've decided that I'm going to go to Israel next year, not only to learn, but I'm going to stay. I'm not going just as a one-year gap program in one of the yeshivas. I'm going to one of the Hesder yeshivas, and I'm going to enroll, and I'm going to stay, and I'm going to join the army. And Debbie and I kind of looked at each other. We were pretty much made the decision we were not going to be staying in Baltimore anyway. And we were kind of figuring out where to go. I had been interviewed by a number of schools, including Atlanta and Los Angeles. And you know what? We said, this is our chance. This is our only chance to go as a family. And so we picked up and we came with Avi, who was then 17, Donnie 15, Ilana 13, and our daughter Shira, who was not quite 4. And we made Aliyah that summer. And I've never looked back, because I find one of the most amazing things that every day of my life here, I feel I'm walking in the footsteps of our ancestors. And there's something just very special about that. I hope you're getting a taste of that today. That in Israel, we literally walk along the footsteps. Thank you, Audrey. Yeah, that we literally walk along the footsteps of our ancestors in this country. I get up every morning and I daven and I say, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak Yaakov, just minutes away from Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov live their lives. And that's really quite something. In any event, we climb up this observation deck along Derech Avot, and we look out and we see in this particular perspective 2 views that I want to talk about in the only about 10 or 15 minutes left. First of all, we're looking west. It's a bit of a hazy day, but we are looking first of all at the city of Beitar, the modern city of Beitar. But I want to come back to that. Beyond Beitar, in the distance, on a clear day, you can actually see the Mediterranean and the tall buildings of Ashdod. On the Mediterranean coast as we look westward towards the Mediterranean. But the valley beyond Beitar is known as Emek HaElah. And Emek HaElah played a very, very significant role, played a very significant role, I'm going to make it obvious, in the biblical narrative. Why? Because, I'm not going to jump maps, but if we go back to the map, you remember we're very close to Bethlehem. Who in our heritage, this is not a trick question, it's a really sincere and honest question, was born in Bethlehem. I'm not talking about somebody who is made holy by another religion. I'm talking about in our tradition. Who's born in Bethlehem? Well, let's go back. Who died and was buried in Bethlehem?
Benjamin?
That's it. That's Rachel. No, David HaMelech. David is born in Bethlehem and grows up in Bethlehem. His Abba, Yishai, is a shepherd in Bethlehem. And David and his brothers grow up in Bethlehem. And at one particular junction, because David kind of grew up in the period of King Saul, and King Saul was constantly fighting Israel's a constant enemy, the Philistines. Where were the Philistines? The Philistines were along the Mediterranean coast, in the back left of this picture. And the confrontation zone was frequently along the valley between the coast, which is in the distance in the picture, and the hill country, if you go back to our earlier maps of Derech HaAvot, which is the area of Judea, which is where the Jewish people lived. David was growing up as a little shepherd at one particular juncture when there's this confrontation between the forces of King Saul, the first king of Israel, and the Philistines, led by their giant warrior named Goliath. And so, as it turns out, David is off bringing supplies to his brothers in the army of King Saul, in the picture that you see in front of us. And by the way, we did a video on just the whole story of David and Goliath and the place of the battle. So that's one of the videos on our Israel is Beautiful website. I think it's a very kind of like fun video. David is asked by his father, Jesse, Yishai, to take food to his brothers, because that's how you fed your armies in those days. They weren't quartermasters, and you had to get food from home. And he happened upon the encampment of the Israelite army just as the giant Goliath was confronting the Israelites, saying, "Send me your best man to do battle against me." They were kind of like determining the rules of battle. Your best against our best. I'm their best, says Goliath. Send me your best. And the psukim in Shmuel Bet in the Tanakh, Shmuel Aleph, are just amazing. It says that nobody wanted to do it. Everybody was afraid. Nobody was ready to take on Goliath. It was like a suicide mission. But David happens to be there. And little boy David, who's not even in the army, he's not old enough to be in King Saul's army, volunteers and says, I'll do it. And evidently Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, doesn't have too many alternatives. So he says, okay, I'm going to lose somebody. I might as well lose a kid, not one of my soldiers. And he tries to put the armor on David. And it's very cute because there's a verse where David turns to King Saul. Remember, David's a little boy, a teenager. And he turns to King Saul and he says, don't you have anything in my size? That's not quite what he says. He says, these do not fit me, or these are not, I am not of stature to fit in this armor, which means, don't you have anything in kid size? And obviously we don't. So David goes out with that armor. And of course, you know the story. The story is that David goes into the stream, picks up 5 stones while Goliath is busy laughing and making fun that he's about to do battle with a kid. David puts one of the stones in his slingshot, loads up, hits Goliath, boom, right in the forehead. The giant falls. Goliath is killed. David takes Goliath's swords, cuts off Goliath's head. And by the way, one of the moments of Jewish history, which is, I should have put this in here. Okay. Maybe our next time I'll remember to put it at the beginning. The menorah outside the Knesset has 42 moments of Jewish history on it. The menorah, which today stands as the symbol of Israel in Jerusalem outside the Knesset building. One of the panels of the 42 moments of Jewish history is the battle of David and Goliath, and David triumphantly holding Goliath's head after severing it with Goliath's own sword. Why here? Why am I mentioning it here? Because that entire confrontation takes place in this valley here, the Emek HaElah, the valley of Elah. And so along Derech HaAvot, along this wonderful path, we have the opportunity to look out over the place where this battle took place. The other thing we see in this picture is the city of Beitar. And the only thing I'm going to mention at this juncture about Beitar is it too is of tremendous historical significance. It was in Beitar that the final battle of the Bar Kokhba rebellion took place. And that was a horrible, terrible defeat. Remember my timeline at the beginning, that was basically the end of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. Our last gasp, 60 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, was the fall of Beitar. Just north of, here we are, just north of where we are, at the exit to this road, is the return to the main highway, which is the highway through Gush Etzion. Here's the sign towards Patriarchs Way. That's the middle sign. Underneath it is where we are going to go as our next to the last stop today, Mitzpor HaElef. Elef means 1,000. Mitzpor comes from the word tzipor, which means bird. It's a bird's view or a lookout. Why HaElef? Because it's at 1,000 meters or 3,000 feet above sea level, one of the highest spots in this area. And it happens to be in the town of Gush Etzion, known as Neve Daniel, which many of you perhaps know of. It's directly across from Efrat. In the distance are some of the houses of Efrat, where I live. It's just on the other side of the main road. So let's climb the stairs to this tower. By the way, I should, before we do that, here we are, there's the tower. And right next to the tower is another one of these Roman milestones. So we are still on the same road. Here's the sign telling us that this is a Even Meal number 10 now. We've gone 3 Roman miles. This is milestone number 10, B'derech HaAvot, along the pathway of the Patriarchs. And we are now going to ascend the steps to the lookout tower, which, as I said, is one of the highest spots in all of this area known as Gush Etzion. So come up the steps with me, and we'll once again look out first west towards Beitar and where David fought Goliath. But we'll also swing around to the south. In the south are Harei Chevron, the Hebron Hills. We'll also look out to the east. Not only do we see the city of Efrat, actually I'm going to go a little further. We see the city of Efrat on the hill directly across. Hazy day, on a clear day, you can see clear into Jordan, the hills of Moab, where Moses stood at the end of the book of Dvarim and begged to come into the land of Israel, literally in view of where we are. And as we swing further along, and complete the view. Coming into view now, looking north, again, hard to make out. Well, I didn't realize that this was not as good as I wanted to be, but let's go further again. Looking north. So you're gonna have to imagine this, but in this direction over here on a clearer day, first of all is Bethlehem, where David came from. And in the distance beyond, you can see some of the taller buildings of Yerushalayim on a clear day. And I just it wasn't clear enough on this particular day. You have to be really lucky to get the kind of day that's not hazy and clear enough to see all the way up to Yerushalayim. But I mentioned this as well because all of our stories begin to relate. Just a moment ago, I talked about Moab. What else happens in Moab? Ruth came from Moab. And now we understand, if you remember the Megillat Ruth, which we read on the holiday of Shavuot, that when there's a famine in the land, Elimelech and his family leave Beit Lechem and they go eastward to Moab. It's not so far. It's the other side of the Jordan River. It's 12 miles away. And Ruth comes from Moab and returns to Beit Lechem. And the verse at the end of the Megillah talks about Ruth being an Eshet Chayil in Beit Lechem and in Ephrata. Relates Bethlehem and Ephrat to cities who were related within the Tanakh to each other along Derech HaAvot. All right. Susan, how strict do we have to be with the 6 o'clock limit? Well, you know what? I hope you forget. Can we go a couple of minutes over?
I think it's fine. You know, it's what if you're okay with it, we're okay with it.
I'm okay with it. I'm good with it.
Okay.
So if you're seeing my screen, I'm going to come back to Shraga on the left there in just a moment. But a reminder of our website, and I'm going to invite all of you to check it out even now. You're going to be entitled to your free month anyway, but you might want to take advantage of some of the things that are there right now. And if you sign up now, we'll give you your extra free month as part of the package too. But our website is called Israel is Beautiful. There are now 71 virtual Tiulim around the country. Most of them are from 12 to 18 minutes in length. And for us, for Ani and me, this has been an extremely exciting adventure to begin to bring Israel in all of its dimension to our friends in Chutz La'aretz. I want to end with my friend Shraga. Now, I like the name Shraga because it's my name also. I never liked the name growing up. It was kind of like a strange name, and I never quite understood why my parents gave me that name until many, many years later did I begin to appreciate that I'm named after my great-grandfather, whose name was Shraga. And when my mother passed away, she actually died at the age of 98 in 2007. She lived a long life. She'd been born in Poland in a town called Lumja. And many of the things that were my great-grandfather's, whose name was my name, came over to me, including his Haggadah, which was printed in Warsaw in 1868, and including many of his Sfarim, which he had in Lumja with him and managed to bring to America when he got to the United States in the 1920s. And I even have a picture of my great-grandfather which was painted in oil, which was painted in Warsaw in 1923. So all of a sudden, the significance of me having the name of an ancestor of mine took on a much greater meaning. And although I never liked the name growing up, because it just was kind of a strange name to grow up with in America, it's not a strange name in Israel. And I am proud of the name and, proud that I carry the name of my great-grandfather, and that many of the things that were meaningful to him in his life are now part of my life. So this is Shraga, but I also want to mention that, I think, today along Derech HaAvot, we're underscoring connections with our past. And I just want you to think back in your own lives, your own family, your own circle of friends within the congregation, people that you do business with. How many of the names from the Tanakh are with us today, that this Jewish tradition of perpetuating names? Moshe. Who is the original Moshe? You carry the name of one of our ancestors. Any Avrahams or Sarahs, any Sarahs here, I'm looking, or Yitzchaks or Yaakovs or Rivkas or Leahs or Rachels or Davids or Shaul's or Moshes or Yehoshua's are Jewish traditions perpetuating 3,000 years later, the names of the people that were to use a modern term, the movers and shakers of Judaism, our ancestors. And so there's something really very special that we take on the names of those who were before us. And many of those names go back not just to the ancestors that we can trace, but undoubtedly through many, 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 many generations, probably more than hundreds of generations, back to the people that originally bore those names, the patriarchs, the matriarchs, and the personalities that that were the highlights of Jewish life in the Tanakh. In any event, so this is Shraga. Shraga was actually my next door neighbor in our first house in Efrat. And Shraga always dreamed of doing something to bring another aspect of the ancient into modern times. So you know what? Let me just go back to one other picture before I come back to Shraga, although you already have a hint. Here, oh, you know what? Let's go back to the almond tree. Fine. So here in the almond tree, you can see in the background behind the almond tree, it looks like something is being cultivated here, something is being planted here. And the truth is, I have other pictures of this along Derech HaAvot as well. This picture also, I think, has vineyards. Because one of the things that ancient Judea was known for was the growing of wine. And Shraga, again, my neighbor, always dreamed of making wine. And so when we were neighbors, he set up a little wine press in his basement and started growing grapes and making wine. And indeed, a number of years ago, I would say maybe 15 years ago, moved it into a full operation of producing wine. And that is what's called today the Gush Etzion Winery, owned and developed, first of all, by Shraga, now managed by his son, who was a little kid when we first moved into the neighborhood 30 years ago, but today manages the winery. And I'm going to see if I can get Shraga. We got share sound. Let's see if we can get what he says, because it's kind of like a nice way to end. Here we are right along Derech HaAvot, going up into the winery. And I asked Shraga to say a few words about what he was doing here.
אנחנו שכנים באפרת. We are happy to see you, Peter, in our winery. You are now in, my name is Shraga. I am the owner of Gush Etzion Winery. It's in the junction of Gush Etzion. Welcome. You can see here the whole vineyard that myself and the kibbutzim plant around. We have now like 90 acres of grain around, a very nice terroir and very high quality. It's cold in the night. Also in this area it's a blessing of Judah, Yaakov Avinu, Judah our father, of wine and grapes. So we built this winery and you're all welcome.
L'chaim, l'chaim.
L'chaim, but now you can't come, maybe order our wine. And we have also our wine is in America, and you can order it. And
Okay, so we have Shraga's, pitch for his winery. The wines happen to be quite good, by the way. But I think the point is, and that's the point on which I'd like to end, that we are blessed to be able to not only walk in the footsteps of our ancestors, but in many ways, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha, return us unto you, God, v'nashuva, and we will return. We will return to many of the things that characterize life of our ancestors here in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, many of hundreds and thousands of years ago. In this case, the wine, the growing of wine once again, and bringing life back. Listen, our generation, I'm kind of looking here, and I have a hunch that there are a few people here. Most of you have been born in the time when there was Israel. Right? Anybody less than 75 is younger than Israel. A few of us, myself included, actually began our lives at the end of the 2,000 years when we were still waiting and dreaming and praying and hoping. And certainly in my very, very young life, that dream came to fruition. And I've had the privilege of living all of my life contemporaneous with the modern state of Israel. But it is indeed my theme today was how privileged we are to once again be able to celebrate and enjoy and walk in the footsteps of those who were our ancestors, who gave us the Judaism that today is our living Judaism, and the privilege that our generation is the one that's been able to see this. This could not have happened 2 generations ago without the land of Israel as a sovereign Jewish state. And Baruch Hashem, we have it. And as Shraga said, if you can't get his wine online, if you can only get his wine online in the meantime, God willing, when you take your congregation trip, your first trip celebrating the return of tourism to Israel, you'll maybe have lunch at the winery, or certainly there are many other things to do. But that's the idea. In other words, you should be once again privileged to return to the land of Israel and see all of these things firsthand. Until that's possible, thank you, Susan, once again, and Rabbi Kurtz. I'm pleased to be your vehicle for bringing Israel into your homes until the time when you can come to visit Israel in person.
All right. Thank you, Peter, for your time. And it was a lovely session. And you got us excited for the next 2 in the series as well. Okay. And we look forward
any questions, by the way? I'm good if you have any questions. Ani is online as well. And if either of you, anybody has any questions or comments, and you don't mind, we're certainly happy to entertain them. Anybody?
Yes, question.
Toby, right?
Yes.
Hi.
So, hi. By the way, I'm
Toby.
a fellow graduate of Brooklyn Law School, but we can talk about that another time.
Oh my gosh.
I'm not going to say how many years, but
well, hey, listen, Toby, I graduated in 1971.
It was more recent than that, a little bit more recent than that, not a whole lot.
Right.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. But so my question is this: from an archaeological point of view, you pointed out a number of different things from the Roman period, but is there anything from earlier than that to say that this particular road that they've chosen to call the Derech Avot is really related to Avraham? And other than the biblical references, are there any archaeological references to prove it?
So to the best of my knowledge, as a fellow attorney, I can say something you will completely understand, that all of the evidence is circumstantial. that there's no real definite evidence along this stretch of road of anything from that time period, except, as I indicated earlier on, the presumption was that ancient roads followed the same path throughout history. And the topography of the land just doesn't lend itself to any other way to get from Hebron towards Jerusalem and further north, except for following the line along which the Derech Avot follows. So that the topography of the land, remember, I kind of alluded to it. I said, you weren't blasting through hills and building tunnels. You weren't building bridges over valleys. You literally had to make your roads relatively level, and therefore stay with the line of the mountains and the valleys and a twisted and turn. And this is the logical route if you are going along with the topography. So short of finding an artifact or a piece of pottery that the archaeologists have identified, there are things from the Hasmonean period, from the Maccabee period along the road. They've found wine presses and olive oil presses. I don't think in this particular area there are things that can be identified as far back as the patriarchs and matriarchs. Ani, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, the one thing that I was going to add is that there was access to natural water all along that road, which would have been critical for people traversing it, which is another reason why it's a very likely candidate, because you have the aquifers that run along it.
Got it. Thank you.
Good question, Toby. Yes, Sharon.
I was wondering, is there any way that we can get a copy of that chart that you put up at the beginning?
For sure, I'll be happy to share that with the Rabbi and Susan.
Okay, that would be great.
You know what, Rabbi, I think that Toby's referring to that first PowerPoint. So, I mean,
Sharon.
I'm sorry, yeah, Sharon, I'm happy to send that first PowerPoint to you if you want to, and then you can extract from it whatever.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. I don't know if you have my address, but you definitely are in touch with Susan. So if you send to her, I could then send it to the people who signed up for the class.
I've always been looking for a chart like that to the development of Israel and who took over and And that's just perfect, just what I wanted.
Let me just, is this the one you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, for sure.
Yeah,
All
that
right,
does
and
look
then-
really great.
Yeah. Listen, I got it on the internet. Today, the internet is an amazing source of resources. By the way, I think actually, this is the wrong PowerPoint. No, that's not the one. I have the slide of David's, whatever. This is the menorah. This is a different PowerPoint, but one of them has the David and Goliath. Where is your PowerPoint? This is it. Right? Is this it? No. All right, whatever. I can't find it. It was well organized before. Now they've all disappeared to different places. But yeah, I'll be happy to send that to
Thank
Susan.
you very much.
the
It was a
rabbi.
wonderful tour.
My pleasure.
Beside the chart, could you send the map of the route? I think
I'm
that
going to
was.
send that entire first PowerPoint with the 8 or 10 slides
Perfect.
of the Derech HaAvot. And again, listen, I deliberately didn't want to get into a political perspective, but clearly for many, the fact that the Derech HaAvot, if you look at it, is the heart of Judea and Samaria, is plays into the political narrative for many people. So that's all I want to say about that. But just you should realize that there's a great, it's much more than 1967 or 1948. But historically, you know what? Let me pull that map up. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Which one is it? Tippy, Physicum. Here it is. 1 second. Let's go up here. So
That's it. Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah. So the Philistines, I don't know if you can see my arrow, were this section over here. This was Philistine. This was Phoenician. The ancient Jewish homeland was Judea, was just down here, and Samaria. So I kind of like superimpose a modern map over this, and you begin to get insights into some of the issues in the current conflict of whatever. I don't want to go further, but you got it.
Peter, Peter, just one other,
Yes.
how much does this sort of parallel Route 38?
It's Route 60.
Route 60, or Route 60, okay.
38 is a little
Just
bit
a
further
little bit,
down
yeah.
to our west,
great.
and it's in the valley already. It's because it goes through Beit Shemesh.
Okay.
It's at the foot of the mountain. So that's 38 is what comes from Shar Hagai from the you know what? Should I go back to Israel? 38 is this. Oh, I didn't want to do that. I just stopped sharing. I wanted to get to the map.
Don't worry about it.
Here it is. 38 is this. Here's Yerushalayim. Here's Beit Shem. Here's what's called Shar Hagai. This is 38.
Okay. Oh,
So
sorry.
this was-
Okay.
If this was a topographical map, this would already be the beginning of the coastal plain. This is the mountain region.
Okay.
Good question, though.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for your time. We want to be sensitive to your time, but God willing, we have 2 other sessions lined up, so there'll be much time to for follow-up questions and for more discussion about these fascinating topics. Thank you, everyone, for coming to our lecture tour this Sunday, and looking forward to the next sessions as well. Thank you, Susan, again, for organizing and bringing Peter in for us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Pleasure meeting all of you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Lahidra
Susan.